So I will hand you straight over now to Professor Conor O'Mahony, who is the Government Child Rapporteur, and his second report, I believe, is in with government at the moment. So I'm really interested to hear from how you responded to these findings as well, Conor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cliona. So I'd just like to begin by congratulating Dr. Michelle Walsh on the completion of a PhD, as well as on the publication of this report. When I was working on my 2021 annual report for government, I was searching around for some data around the experiences of adolescents of sexual abuse and harassment in Ireland, and couldn't find anything. And after a little bit of crowdsourcing on Twitter, Michelle very kindly got in touch and sent me on a copy of her PhD. So I had an opportunity to see the completed lengthy document, which is a really, really fabulous piece of work, and which provides an incredibly in-depth and robust basis for this shorter report. But the process of shortening it, and Cliona mentioned earlier on that that's a difficult thing to do, but a very important thing to do in order to bring the research to a wider audience. So up to now in Ireland, we've probably had a lot of anecdote and impression around this issue, but not a lot of robust data. And so now this report gives us a first pass at providing some really strong data on the nature and scale of this problem. It echoes findings from other jurisdictions. There was a report published earlier this year by Ofsted in England, and that documented what they called the normalization of sexual harassment and online sexual abuse in schools. And so there's a real correspondence, I suppose, between the findings of these two reports. As Niall mentioned earlier on, to many people working in the sector, some of these findings don't come as a huge surprise, but they are still jarring when you see all of the detail laid out together in one place like this. But I think to the more general public, I think to people who aren't closely engaged with this issue, it will be quite shocking to see just how many adolescents experience sexual harassment in a short period of time of just 12 months. And it may also be shocking to see the incidence of sexual harassment which is perpetrated by adolescents. So in that respect, the report is a really important wake-up call. I think this is the kind of issue where if policymakers or legislators don't see it, there's a risk they don't do anything about it, and complacency can be a really serious hurdle to progressive change. And it may be the case that up to now that policymakers or legislators just weren't aware of the reality of adolescent lives. And if they don't see the problem themselves, then they may not realize that they need to act to address it and to address the reality of the lives of the adolescents in our families and communities. Now, it's significant, obviously, as a way of informing reforms in policy and law, but it's also significant legally and has an important role in triggering the state's legal obligations to act to address this issue. And so in particular here, I'm referring to the European Convention on Human Rights, which imposes obligations on states to take steps to mitigate the risk that people would experience sexual abuse or harassment. And that obligation is triggered in circumstances where the state either is aware of the risk or ought to be aware of the risk. And in particular, that principle I'm deriving from the European Court of Human Rights decision in 2014 in the Louise O'Keeffe case, which was of course an Irish case. And in that case, what the court held was that the state was aware, by virtue of the 1931 Carrigan Committee report, of the fact that there was a very high incidence of sexual crime against children. And because of that, the state was then deemed to be obliged to take reasonable steps to mitigate that risk that children in schools might experience sexual abuse. And the state's failure to have done so led to a finding in that case of a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, that case obviously was in the context of abuse perpetrated by a teacher, but by the same token, if the state either is aware or ought to be aware of the risk that students may be abused or harassed by other students, then similarly the state is obliged to ask or to act to mitigate that risk. And if the state is aware or ought to be aware that certain cohorts of students are at an increased risk, well, then obviously that obligation is heightened in that context. So this report certainly provides the evidence that the risk is very real, that it's very pressing, and that it's not going to go away by itself. And so from that perspective, that certainly, in my view, triggers the state's obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights to take reasonable measures to mitigate the risks which have been identified in the report. So in short, the state can hardly now claim, in light of evidence of this nature, that it was not or ought not have been aware that there is a pervasive risk of sexual harassment faced by Irish adolescents. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights is one angle for introducing this obligation. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is another. The Convention on the Rights of the Child obliges in Article 19 that states take all appropriate measures to protect children from all forms of violence, including sexual abuse. And this includes the establishment of social programs to provide support for children and other forms of prevention, identification, investigation, and treatment. So there's a lot of work to do. And in Michelle's presentation earlier on, she referenced the fact that a huge amount of this abuse is happening online. So online abuse is clearly a hugely important issue. Niall discussed this a little bit in his presentation. And the Oireachtas is currently working on the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill, which is an important opportunity to provide stronger regulation of online activity and ways of tackling online abuse. But there are significant gaps in the bill in its current form. In particular, the bill doesn't provide for an individual complaints mechanism that would lead to a legal obligation to remove harmful material where complaints are upheld. So that's an important gap in the bill which really needs to be addressed. And I've made written and oral submissions to the relevant Oireachtas committee on that point. More generally then, the other strategy for tackling this issue, which I'd like to mention, is broadly speaking the whole area of education. So this has been highlighted in particular by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which has called on state parties to implement educational measures for children directed to improve their pro-social attitudes, competencies and behaviours. And those of you who read Dr. Walsh's report will notice the very strong overlap between that recommendation and some of the recommendations in the report. Specifically in relation to Ireland, in 2016, the committee called on Ireland to adopt a comprehensive sexual and reproductive health policy for adolescents and to ensure that sexual and reproductive health education is part of the mandatory school curriculum. Now, when we talk about education in this context, there are a number of colleagues of mine in the School of Law and UCC who've been engaged in some very cutting edge work in the use of education as a way of addressing sexual harassment. So just to mention a couple of those quickly, Professor Louise Crowley has led the introduction of a bystander intervention program in UCC, which has been a huge success and which has since been replicated in other Irish universities and is also there's evidence about its successes in other jurisdictions as well. The aim of the bystander intervention program is to highlight the danger of normalizing or accepting abusive behavior and through education to inform and to empower young people to better understand their capacity to intervene as pro-social bystanders. So that has a lot of promise and a lot of potential and is certainly something we could look at rolling out on a broader level, not just in universities, but also in schools. Now, this is one educational measure, but it's not the only one. A recently published paper by other colleagues of mine, Dr. Aoife Daly and Dr. Catherine O'Sullivan, has explored the idea of sexuality education as a right of the child. And they point to the importance of sexuality education, including sexual health, relationships and consent. And they note that the failure to properly educate children on these issues can mean that they are unprotected or that they can cause harm to others. So this is something which we have struggled with as a country in Ireland. In a very detailed report published in 2019, the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, they concluded that for most students, their experience of relationships and sexuality education can be summed up as too little, too late, and too biological. So the dominant approach is concerned with risks and dangers and doesn't allow for a sufficient discussion of positive, healthy and enjoyable aspects of relationships, as well as the challenges. So the NCAA recommended that the curriculum should be redeveloped to address these issues, including the impact of the internet and social media, including consent, LGBTQ plus matters, healthy and positive sexual expression, and so on. So the NCCA has established 2 development groups, one for primary schools and one for post-primary, to oversee development work arising from its 2019 report. And so that work is ongoing. They're hoping to have a revised junior cycle curriculum by 2022 and a revised senior cycle curriculum by 2023. This work is welcome, it's needed, and my annual report, which Lena mentioned, has been submitted to government for this year and will publish later in the year, endorses the recommendations of the NCCA's report from 2019. So the hope really will be that all parties will work together to see those recommendations implemented. But we know that from past experience that this can be a challenging space in terms of the role of parents and the relationship between the state and parents in this respect. But from a children's rights lens, the role that education has to play in addressing the risk that children will experience sexual abuse or harassment is clear. And certainly if we are to prioritise children's rights and best interests, then this is a space in which we cannot fail to act. So I'm a little over my time. I will have to leave it there. I just want to again congratulate the RCNI on the work that has gone into this report and into today's seminar. So certainly I will be doing everything I can to advocate to see this research disseminated and its recommendations furthered. And I'm happy to engage in the Q&A afterwards. Thanks very much.